saw the house for the first time on June the 11th, 1962, while driving by its ghostly and incongruous resemblance to early colonial salt box houses of New England. Intrigued to solve its mysteries, we began the first of many visits that continue to the present.
Not much hinders one's view of the Johnston House when one is traveling along Highway 1 south of Half Moon Bay on the San Mateo County, California coastline. While the condition of the house has changed from the present to when Malcolm and Joan Watkins glimpsed the building in the 60s, back to when James P. Johnston's family settled there, the essential quality of the structure has remained the same. That quality involves an architecture imported to California from the eastern states, an architecture formed by Eastern and European sensibilities. California was, in the mid-19th century, one more frontier for a flood of pioneers looking ever west for more land and new wealth. Yet one pioneer, who had made his way to the very edge of the continent, found himself reflecting back across his trail. The house he built attests as much to the length of his journey as does the number of the miles. The Johnston House is a rare survival of many such structures built by settlers. They recalled the lands from which they'd come and the homes and construction techniques used in those places. A migration west in the 1840s entailed a long, difficult journey. But rather than obscure the past, the miles may have made keener the thoughts of home. For some, long migrations west were somehow shortened by importing to California ways of life and architecture formed back east. To reconstruct the life of a person is in some ways similar to rebuilding a historic home. Evidence is blurred and the challenge becomes finding a way to connect information through gaps in time. For a person, one may use records and photographs, and often conjecture to discover a story. For a house, one may sift through pieces of lumber, trace construction styles, and sometimes guess to discover what was once original. The ongoing effort by many to rediscover the man in the house benefits all those who wish to reflect back on history, as pioneers once looked back to their homelands. The Johnston saga reveals many of the traditions, aspirations, occupations, beliefs, and cultures that flowed into California in the 19th century. James P. Johnston's life began far from the shores of the Pacific in Melrose, Scotland. Born on October 7, 1813, he was the firstborn of William and Allison Johnston. In 1818, the call of a better life soon drove the family, who by then had two more children, William and Thomas, to board the ship the Prompt and head for America. They landed in New York that same year and made their way inland, eventually settling in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Little is known of these formative years of James Johnston's life, yet the region had a profound impact in shaping the conservative Eastern views he would carry with him west. In 1826, the Johnston family faced the death of William, leaving Allison and 8 children without a provider. It is thought that this death prompted Allison in 1834 to move the family by flatboat down the Ohio River to the town of Gallipolis, Ohio. They settled 2 miles west of town and began raising dairy cattle on the open plains, a business James would later establish in California. Evidence gathered from this period suggests that the family lived in a conservative ranch-style salt box house, much like the one Johnston later built for his family in Half Moon Bay. This photo of a daguerreotype found among the family's possessions illustrates white-painted clapboards, symmetrically placed windows, and a classically balanced facade, all aspects of traditional New England architecture. The Johnston daguerreotype suggests that the house it depicts is James' idea of a proper dwelling of a gentleman farmer, an idea that would accompany him to the new reality of California. The restless 21-year-old Johnston remained only briefly on the plains of Ohio before embarking in search of adventure. In the late 1830s, he participated as a soldier in the Second Florida Seminole War, fought by the Indians in resistance of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Soon after the war ended, Johnston joined an expedition to the mostly uncharted Rocky Mountains, making his first trip west. After a brief stint back in Gallipolis, Johnston once again went into military service, this time traveling to Mexico to participate in the Mexican War of 1842 through 1845. The Mexican-American War proved to be a significant event which would help shape Johnston's later years. His exposure to Mexico apparently fascinated him, and it is thought that he embraced many aspects of Hispanic culture. He is said to have collected Spanish literature including a book of Mexican engravings that he gave to his sister Isabel. His familiarity with Hispanic culture would serve as a valuable asset to gain the trust of ranch owners on the coast side. When the Mexican-American War concluded, Johnston returned to Gallipolis. Already appraised of the situation in the West, the cry of gold in California in 1849 to Johnston signaled his departure. The sea of people heading west, in California's eminent statehood, provided opportunities beyond the lure of the mines. He traveled to California on the steamship Oregon, the same ship which brought the news of statehood the following year. At that time, the steamship was the fastest mode of transportation and also very expensive. Johnston apparently already had the means to travel first class. The world literally rushed in on California during the gold rush. The state grew from a population counted in the tens of thousands until 1860, when nearly 400,000 people resided there. San Francisco alone saw the number of its inhabitants increase from 400 people in 1849 to over 30,000 people by the end of 1850. The pioneers that came to the edge of the continent from all over the country and the world brought varying backgrounds, cultures, and beliefs. The furious pace of expansion gives one an impression of California and its diverse residents in the 1850s. A land which had grown slowly boomed with people, land speculation, construction, and gold fever. Establishments built on the coast side prior to 1849 attest to the sharp transition California felt during the gold rush years. These structures reveal a place of different influences than those arriving with prospectors such as Johnston. Coastside author June Morale and Mitch Postal, a historian at the San Mateo County Historical Association, discussed the transitional period in California history.
Oh, now what's the connection between this house and the Sanchez adobe? Sanchez adobe goes way back.
Well, the interesting thing about Johnston House, Sanchez adobe, Woodside Store, all three of these stand today. So they were all built within an 8-year span. You know, Sanchez adobe was completed in 1846, and the Woodside Store was completed in 1854. And somewhere in between was the Johnston House. And they really represent the change from Mexican California to California under the United States. I mean, with Francisco Sanchez's house of 1846, you've got, you know, your standard California adobe, you know, Rancho, the Rancho experience, Francisco Sanchez being an alcalde of San Francisco, being a comandante of the Presidio, all the stories that are equated with the Mexican Times, Francisco Sanchez. And then at the Woodside Store, you've got the Yankee entrepreneurs, Dr. R.O. Tripp and M.A. Parkhurst, who are in the lumber business. They're into local politics. They're trying to make a buck any way they can. You know, they open up the store. It's a very lucrative business right from the get-go, and they're very successful. And then in the missing link, you know, between these Yankees and the Hispanic Times is here this Johnston family, which includes a Hispanic wife and an Ohioan, you know, Argonaut, a guy that was looking for gold. You know, the reason he came was because of the gold. And here they've got this house that's built in a New England style, and yet it's got a Catholic chapel. It really serves, I think, to link this period of very rapid change all together.
Tell me about the Johnston House. When was it built, and who built it, and why did they build it?
Well, we think it was built about 1852, 1853, and James Johnston was a pioneer gold rush seeker. He was reminiscent of many of the Argonauts that came to California, you know, looking for gold. One of the misconceptions about the gold rush is that people say, oh, well, just a few found gold. But in actuality, many found gold. It was just how much gold you were going to find. And Johnston was one of those that did find some and did make some money, and became involved in the El Dorado Saloon. And he was involved with
where was that? The El Dorado Saloon?
That was in San Francisco. It was a very famous or infamous place. It was where a lot of the San Franciscans met to make their deals. It was a gambling house. There was other things going on there.
Johnston's involvement with the mines perhaps allowed him to attain even greater success as an entrepreneur. He became part owner of the infamous El Dorado Saloon in San Francisco. He bought land around the peninsula and soon took part in purchasing land claims from Spanish Californios against the U.S. government. Spanish language skills no doubt aided these activities, as he became acquainted through business with old Spanish families who owned vast tracts of land in the area. His marriage in April 1852 to Petra de Jara, a member of an old Spanish family, perhaps cemented his involvement with the prominent families of San Benito. This union represented a bridge between cultures and a blending of Petra's staunch Catholicism and James' Protestantism. In a way, the Johnston marriage was a merging of cultures in small, taking place throughout California. With agriculture still a dominant theme of American life in the 1850s, it is not surprising that Johnston looked for a way to invest his money in an area suited to agricultural activities. His vision of bringing eastern dairy cattle to California and establishing a New England-style farm, similar to his arrangement in Gallipolis, must have been a top priority as he searched for land along the California coast. He found such a place in a tiny, isolated Hispanic village of San Benito on the coast of what would soon become San Mateo County. He was among the very first Americans to visit San Benito, which would be renamed Spanish Town and finally Half Moon Bay. Here he found the terrain necessary to make his vision come true, and a place possessed of Petra's language and culture. He began negotiations with Candelario Miramontes to acquire 1,162 acres of the San Benito Ranch. In anticipation of the transaction's success, Johnston dispatched his brother Thomas, also a resident of California, to return to Gallipolis to round up 800 head of cattle. With two other brothers, John and William, he was to bring them overland to San Benito. As planned, the cattle were led across the country on an epic drive, the first introduction of domesticated dairy cows to San Mateo County. The deed for the land on which Johnston built was signed May 13, 1853. The obstacles to building a structure the size of the Johnston House were formidable in the 1850s. While sources of lumber were plentiful east in the hills or on the bayside, the difficulty lay in the logistics of moving redwood logs. Perhaps some logs were moved with the aid of teams of oxen, but floating lumber from the ocean onto the beach, almost at the doorstep of the house site, seems most plausible. The architecture James selected was a direct reflection of his life before his many travels. He was raised in an age still influenced by the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. The concept of agricultural lands presided over by comfortable, even elegant farmhouses was a prevalent one. Johnston most likely envisioned a house of traditionally classical qualities that embodied the Scottish regard for the rural countryside. The house, by its location, allowed him to embrace the vistas of Western expansion, and by its architectural style, allowed him to shape those vistas with the tradition of American country life he learned in youth. In any case, Johnston's very traditional house was an appropriate setting for the entrepreneurial gentleman farmer he so briefly became. Outwardly antique but modish in its interior, the house expresses Johnston's pride of achievement as a pioneer California settler. As Elizabeth Johns wrote in her essay, Settlement and Development Claiming the West, one of the earliest activities of those who moved west was to mark the new territory as their own by building a home. It was a permanent home that distinguished the solid citizen, setting apart the responsible entrepreneur who lived an orderly life from the adventurer who drifted from one flash in the pan to another. This was to be the family's home until shortly after Johnston's death in 1879. The house, upon first glance, can be categorized as a typical Eastern salt box, rectangular in shape with a symmetrically pitched roof. Because in California the climate did not require a huge central fireplace for warmth, it is thought that Johnston abandoned this trait of the Eastern salt box. His house instead contained a small brick chimney and a marble fireplace on each floor. The extended rear, thought to be a Chinese cook's quarters, was added later. Another aspect of the house that made it unique in California was the use of post and beam mortise and tenon framing. Unlike the balloon framing method shown here, which uses sticks of universal 2x4s fastened together quickly by hammer and nail, the Johnston House employs a vast array of posts and braces, connected by interlocked joints and wooden trunnels. The art of shaping posts and beams and joining them by means of mortise joists derives from the Middle Ages. As this footage from a production entitled Sam Daggett's House, 600 Miles from Home, demonstrates, structural members were precisely chiseled so that each would fit exactly into the next. After repeated testing until the joining was accurate, holes were bored through the posts and beams at each joint. Wooden pins called trunnels could then be driven through to hold the members together when the frame was erected. The primary structure of the Johnston House follows the same basic construction. The posts are less massive than other colonial houses, while the studs tend to be both heavier and more closely spaced than other post and beam, mortise and tenon structures. There is also evidence that the Johnston House framing was cut by rotary saw and not shaped by axe, as were the Daggett and other colonial houses. The facade of the house conforms to traditional practices and tastes. The symmetrical window arrangement reflects 18th century rationalism and a balance that pervades formal Georgian architecture. The mark of elegance was the elaborate, classical, and hand-plastered three-dimensional front door frame constructed around the center door. The unique style of the James Johnston House is well exemplified when comparing it to the house of his brother William, just a few hundred yards away. While James' house stands as a tribute to his Eastern roots and his conservative ideas, William's house is more daring in its architectural style. A Victorian home, the William Johnston House was built with balloon framing and is asymmetrical in its construction. It conveys the feelings of a California newcomer desiring the latest of architectural fashions. Through 1861 are agreed to be the glory years of the Johnston House. During this time, James and Petra had 4 children: James P. Johnston Jr. in 1853, Alice Maria Teresa de Jesus in 1854, John Francis in 1856, and Thomas Francis in 1859. By most accounts, the Johnston House during this period was a great gathering place of the community and a beacon for weary travelers needing a place to rest for the night. Mrs. Hilla Griffith Wolfe, who visited the Johnston House as a child, wrote that the house was the palatial home of James Johnston, the White House, a model of grace and elegance to the coast side. The Johnston House and family symbolized the blending of ideas, cultures, races, and religions that informed the pluralistic nature of the entire country in the 19th century. In addition to James, Petra, and the children, Petra's mother, Melita, resided in the home. Petra and her mother worshipped in a chapel from which various items survived with the family's possessions, including a tearful statue of the Madonna and a hand-embroidered altar cloth. One or more Chinese cooks ran the kitchen, and the ranch hands were most likely Hispanic Californios from nearby San Benito. Presumably, William's ranch next door presented a similar picture, and various family members lived in both houses during and after this 6-year period from 1855 through 1861. The furnishings the house contained were extraordinarily elegant for a frontier ranch. Original furniture that descended in the Johnston family points to a high degree of Victorian refinement. What remains of clothes and hats and such in photographs also attests to a similar taste in luxury.
In 1974, you might remember that the property came to the city, and there was a great festivity, and the effort and the intent was that an historical park be made of the property. Now, the exhibit as we visualize it is going to be very unique. There isn't any such structure in California. There isn't any building that we know of that has been furnished in this period. What we think is important, too, is the very short time span that we have projected for this exhibit. The materials in this exhibit are from 1855 through 1861 when Petra died. A lot of these objects may be earlier than 1855, which would be sensible in that people have inherited things and used them, and James Johnston was wheeling and dealing, and who knows how much he got from people who came out here for the gold rush. You have a whole incredible collection of opportunities, it seems to me, to do educational work with objects that we now all we have to fill out what we have with a lot of little, what would seem to be unimportant things, but which make exhibits believable, just like everybody has in their house. What's on the coffee table, what's on the shelves, the books, the conch shell that people listen to, on the parlor table, all these little dinky things, which by themselves mean nothing, and are sitting on shelves in antique shops. When you collect them all together, and they are right in terms of period, you will make an interesting and believable exhibit. But someone has sewing going on at a table. Somebody's got a shawl on a rocking chair, or somebody put their eyeglasses down on the kitchen table on a newspaper, and they've just stopped eating there, or they're in the middle of making a pie, or there's something on the stove, and so we are able, when you go through this exhibit, to see that, well, somebody just stepped out of the room, and here we are, part of it. What was going on? We are hoping that when people leave here, they will be able to contrast the details of their own everyday life clearly with that which they have seen in this house. They will know how people had to deal with getting water, understand that you had to wash clothes in a tub and haul water for that purpose, that you cooked on a cast iron stove, that you had to fuel with wood or some other fuel. We hope that everything that they do in their daily life, they will be able to find as a counterpart in this house and get a picture of what life in California was like at that time.
Plans for a Johnston House museum include a recreation of the Ursula de Hatta garden on the south side of the house. Called Melita, or Little Mother, Ursula played an important role in Johnston's home. The garden was apparently James Johnston's mother-in-law's pride and joy. Judy Lamore, a consultant to the Johnston House Project on Historical Gardens, and the master gardener at the Cypress Grove Audubon Preserve in Tomales, California, describes the important aspects of the garden that will be a major feature of the proposed Johnston House Museum facility.
This is what was very important about Melita's garden, that it was all fragrant. This is very indicative. And this also putting in the linen closet, but it made just wonderful jelly. It also, you can take the leaves, you make a nice simple yellow cake, and you lay the leaves down in the bottom of the pan, and then you flip it over and you get this lovely design, and the fragrance, just very subtle. So this is going to be in Melita's garden, and we're going to use cuttings from this garden down to Melita's garden. And that's the one thing I'm very adamant about, is taking snips or plants from older gardens and keep them going on, because that's how all the gardens came about, these old California gardens. And this is something that I think that is important concerning Melita's garden. You know, after you read the poem and you think, oh, must be some rare and beautiful flower down there, and they could only grow there. Well, another master gardener and I, Donna, we're trying to research this particular iris, and we decided it was a Spuria iris, but then there are, a dozen of them, and so we're trying, with magnifying glasses and figure out exactly which one it is, and finally, we were just getting awfully excited, so we narrowed it down to 3, and we really wanted it to be something spectacular and rare that only grew here and nowhere else. This is a very common Spuria iris, and after I did all this research, I mean, I've seen these for years and years and years, but, it's a Spuria iris, no big deal, but, somehow this romance, of the old garden, we did romanticize it and became, Sherlock Holmes, and looking through our 17-powered hand lens and counting anthers and all of that stuff. I go to Tomales to I had to go down to a neighbor's on Main Street to bring something or whatever, and I was coming out of the house and I said, those are the irises that grow at Cypress Grove. Where did you get these? Oh, they came from next door. It's the next door, and you can see next door and next door. Nothing terribly spectacular at all. Nothing rare, but at the same time, it should be indicative of the older gardens, unless again, you're a plant breeder, or you're just, completely loony bins like I am, of finding, the rare plant. It just isn't going to happen. There has to be a vision. Now, whether you do it month by month or year by year, this looks cute and that, and it can become very old, and the plants will expand and grow, but there has to be a vision. And I believe that there was a vision down there in Melita's garden.
Tragedy rocked the family soon after James Johnston had established Half Moon Bay's first schoolhouse in 1858. On November 16, 1859, Alice Maria Teresa de Jesus died at the age of 4. Just 2 years after that, in 1861, the family experienced an even greater loss as Petra and a baby she was to have born died from complications during childbirth. This was the beginning of the end of the prominence of the Johnston family. James sent for his sister Isabel, still living back in Gallipolis, who came a few months later to live in the Half Moon Bay home. Isabel and Melita helped to raise the children, while Johnston, devastated by the loss of his wife, retreated to San Francisco, taking a more active role in the running of the El Dorado. He returned home only rarely after 1861 to the White House he had built on the hill. In 1877, the home and ranch Johnston had created, the lifestyle he had forged on the coast side, was lost. A delayed victim of a financial panic in 1873, Johnston lost his land after mortgaging it to buy 400 more acres. The San Francisco Savings Union foreclosed on the family during hearings held in the old Redwood City Courthouse, leaving Johnston broken. His boys, claiming that the ranch was a common property of James and Petra, sued the bank for the land, but only received 15 lots, one of which supported the Johnston House. The bank sold the rest of the acreage in 1878 for $97,000. Johnston died at the Commercial Hotel in San Francisco on October 2, 1879, just 5 days shy of his 66th birthday. The house was eventually inherited by John F. Johnston, second eldest in the Johnston clan. In the years that followed, he rented it to Joe Fernand, a Portuguese sharecropper. The cultural diversity, which was and is a trademark of California, was again demonstrated in this transaction of this property, although Johnston would never again own the landmark. After a time, Fernand also wanted to sell the house, only to have his sale delayed by the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. It is thought that the Johnston House sustained major damage, including cracked plaster and the crumbling of a lean-to addition of the house. The most severe damage, however, was done to the south wall, which needed to be completely ripped out and replaced. Fir was used to make repairs instead of the original redwood. It was initially through the efforts of Joan and Malcolm Watkins that the house stands historically preserved today. After seeing the house for the first time on June 11, 1962, the former Smithsonian curators were granted funds by the Smithsonian to prepare a photographic and written record of the house. With the help of George H. Watson of Sturbridge, Massachusetts, one of the outstanding experts in the field of historic restoration, much was learned of how the house looked in the 1850s. A storm in the winter of 1976 delayed the restoration project, as the south wall was down at the time for renovation purposes. The strong coastal winds could enter but not escape. The entire structure was flattened. The most important event in the history of the house to follow was the acquisition of the property by the city of Half Moon Bay. Much work and effort has gone into the Johnston House since that proud day in 1976. The Johnston House Foundation has worked diligently to fulfill their March 76 goal to incorporate the rare salt box house as the principal building in a historic park that will serve as a repository for other valuable and endangered structures and items on the San Mateo County coast. Like the Sanchez Adobe and Woodside Store, the Johnston House will serve as a public access museum, a structure which reflects the pioneer spirit and Eastern mentality of one traveler west. The years established for museum interpretation, 1855 through 1861, saw not only the best years in the lives of the Johnston clan at the house, but a unique period of transition in California history. The park will be devoted to the historic beginnings and early ways of life on the San Mateo County coast, and more specifically Half Moon Bay. Teresa Ambrosi Smith, Director of Parks and Recreation for the City of Half Moon Bay, and Jack McHugh, President of the Johnston House Foundation, explain some of the long-term goals of the project.
There are three entities involved in trying to bring the Johnston House project to fruition and make the site available to the public. They are the County Historical Association, the city, and the Johnston House Foundation.
The thing that we should talk about is the three groups that working together has been a very important factor here today, because as we've come from the small beginnings of the Johnston House Foundation, bringing it forward, it's been a struggling step every part of the way. You take 2 steps forward and 10 steps back. now that we've got the various organizations working in harmony together, it has become that our pace has been rapidly increasing towards the opening of the Johnston House, which is the ultimate goal that we have. This will be set up as a farm, and we're going to set it up as a park too, as far as for coming down the coast to stop off and see. And then I think that will be very important for our exposure and future of the house operations as well as money.
There will be living history exhibits. Currently they do living history at the Adobe and the store. The Adobe, they do Adobe brick making. At the Woodside store, they do shingle making. They make candles, they do things like that. At the Johnston House, we have an interpretive plan which calls for various historical themes to be presented there, and some of them have to do with farming, some of them have to do with uses for herbs and for medicinal purposes, how to churn butter, those kinds of things can be displayed at the Johnston House, and you'll have a hands-on opportunity to participate in the Living History program. So one of our immediate goals is, by March '94, to have this community garden and heirloom garden project available for people who want to participate. Between now and then, we will be collecting what we're calling seed money. If you want to contribute seed money to the garden project, we can be in touch with you and make you aware of how to make those contributions.
That's right. Along with participation and volunteers in setting up the garden too.
The Johnston House Foundation, a nonprofit organization, can only function through the generosity of groups, state and local agencies, and most importantly, individuals. The generosity of individuals is the best indicator of support for any project such as this. For individuals will benefit most from the existence of a historic museum site on the San Mateo coast just south of Half Moon Bay. Currently, money and volunteer labor are needed to acquire garden supplies and equipment for the completion of the historic garden project, as well as to complete many other projects vital to the long-awaited fruition of this effort. To restore the Johnston House is to assure the preservation of a historic architecture and an unspoiled landscape. The Johnston House Foundation has made a commitment to celebrate this history of a family and house from our collective past, to preserve John Johnston's boyhood memory of his father's ranch sloping down from the hills to the ocean, which in summertime was one sweep of golden grain.